the gold standard, died in 1971. But the dollar didn't collapse. Instead, it did something far more dangerous. It fused itself to the one resource every nation on Earth desperately needs. And for 50 years, that fusion has quietly determined who rises, who falls, and who gets to write the rules of the global economy. Welcome to the Wealth Timeline, where we uncover how money, power, and history intertwine to shape the world we live in. To understand the petrodollar, you have to go back to the moment the old system died. August 15th, 1971. President Richard Nixon appears on television and announces that the United States will no longer honor its commitment to convert dollars into gold. The Bretton Woods system, the framework that had governed global finance since World War II, collapses overnight. For nearly 3 decades, the dollar had been anchored to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar. It was stable, predictable. But by 1971, America was hemorrhaging gold reserves. The Vietnam War, massive government spending, and persistent trade deficits had flooded the world with more dollars than the US could back with its gold stockpile. So Nixon severed the link, and suddenly the dollar was floating, backed by nothing but faith. No gold, no commodity, just trust in the US government's ability to manage its economy. Currency markets panicked, inflation spiked. Oil-producing nations, who had been selling their most valuable resource in exchange for dollars, were furious. The real value of their earnings was evaporating. The question became urgent. How do you keep the world using your currency when it's no longer tied to anything real? The answer came from the desert, and it would reshape the next half-century of geopolitics. In 1973, the world faced its first oil shock. OPEC imposed an embargo in response to US support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadrupled. Western economies staggered under the weight of energy inflation. But American policymakers saw something else, an opportunity. In 1974, US Treasury Secretary William Simon flew to Saudi Arabia. The mission was classified. The goal was simple: convince the Saudis to price all of their oil exports exclusively in US dollars, and to recycle their petrodollar revenues back into American Treasury securities. The Saudis agreed. In exchange, the United States offered military protection, advanced weaponry, and a security guarantee that would shield the Saudi monarchy from both external threats and internal rebellion. It was a bargain forged not in international law, but in mutual dependence. And then the deal spread. One by one, other OPEC members followed Saudi Arabia's lead. By the end of the 1970s, the majority of global oil transactions were conducted in dollars. This was the birth of the petrodollar system, and its implications were staggering. Every country that needed oil, which was virtually every industrialized nation, now needed dollars to buy it. This created artificial, structural demand for US currency. No matter how much America printed, no matter how large its deficits grew, the world had to keep holding dollars. Because the world had to keep buying energy. The US Treasury could issue debt at lower interest rates than any other nation. American banks could lend more freely. The Federal Reserve gained unprecedented influence over global liquidity. The dollar wasn't just a currency anymore. It was infrastructure. But this arrangement came with a darker architecture. Nations that tried to bypass the dollar faced isolation. Or worse, Iraq announced in 2000 that it would begin selling oil in euros. 3 years later, the country was invaded. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency to replace the dollar in oil trade. In 2011, NATO intervened, and Gaddafi was dead within months. Correlation isn't causation, but the pattern was visible to those paying attention. The petrodollar wasn't just an economic system. It was a geopolitical enforcement mechanism. For decades, the system held. But cracks began forming in the 2000s. China's rise changed the calculation. By 2010, China had become the world's largest energy importer. Yet every barrel of oil it bought required dollars, currency controlled by its greatest geopolitical rival. Beijing began exploring alternatives. In 2018, China launched the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, allowing oil futures to be traded in yuan, backed by gold convertibility. It was a direct challenge to dollar dominance. Russia, facing waves of Western sanctions after 2014, accelerated its de-dollarization efforts. It sold off US Treasury holdings, increased gold reserves, and began settling energy contracts in euros, yuan, and rubles. Then came the sanctions war of 2022. When the US and Europe froze Russian central bank assets and cut major Russian banks from the SWIFT payment system, it sent a chilling message to every nation outside the Western alliance. Your dollar reserves are not safe. If the United States could weaponize the dollar against a nuclear-armed G20 economy, it could do it to anyone. Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the petrodollar system, began hedging. In 2023, the kingdom joined the BRICS economic bloc and opened discussions about accepting yuan for oil sales to China. The 50-year pact that had anchored dollar hegemony was fraying. The expiration of the formal US-Saudi Security for Oil understanding in June 2024 marked a symbolic inflection point. While oil continued to trade primarily in dollars, the inevitability of that arrangement was no longer assured. But here's the paradox. Even as nations diversify away from the dollar, they remain trapped by it. Because the petrodollar didn't just create demand for US currency, it embedded the dollar into the deepest layers of the global financial system. Central bank reserves, international debt markets, commodity exchanges, trade finance. Unwinding that structure isn't a policy choice. It's an architectural overhaul that could destabilize the entire system. And that's the trap. The very mechanism that gave America unrivaled power has also made the world fragile, interconnected, and dependent on the stability of a single nation's fiscal policy. Today, approximately 80% of global oil trade is still conducted in dollars. But that figure is declining. In 2023, roughly 58% of global central bank reserves were held in dollars, down from 71% in 1999. Meanwhile, global debt denominated in dollars exceeds $13 trillion outside the United States. Emerging markets from Turkey to Argentina have borrowed heavily in dollars, meaning that any strengthening of the currency tightens financial conditions worldwide, even in countries that have no direct control over US monetary policy. This creates the modern paradox. The petrodollar system gives America extraordinary privilege, but it also exports American monetary policy shocks to the rest of the world. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to fight domestic inflation, it triggers currency crises, capital flight, and debt defaults across the developing world. And as that resentment builds, more nations are quietly building parallel systems. Digital currencies, bilateral trade agreements, regional payment networks, all designed to reduce reliance on the dollar. The question isn't whether the petrodollar will last forever. The question is, what happens when it doesn't? Because history shows us that when a reserve currency loses its dominance, the transition is rarely smooth. So what can we take from this story? First, the petrodollar was never just about oil. It was about creating a structural need for dollars that would outlast any single commodity or trade relationship. Second, power built on dependency is fragile. The very system that gave the United States unmatched financial leverage also made the world vulnerable to its policy decisions and resentful of its control. Third, history doesn't end. Every empire believes its currency is eternal. Rome's denarius, Spain's silver real, Britain's pound sterling, each dominated global trade. Each seemed permanent, until it wasn't. The petrodollar has lasted 50 years. That's longer than the Bretton Woods gold standard, longer than most empires' monetary hegemonies. But the timeline of wealth is unforgiving, and the systems that seem most unshakable are often the ones closest to transformation. Because in the timeline of wealth, every rise comes with a hidden cost. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Wealth Timeline, and turn on the bell icon. Because history's next secret is already unfolding.